It was a quiet morning in the small town of Shepherdsville, Kentucky, until everything changed. A teenage girl vanished without a trace, and what happened next felt more like a detective thriller than a real-life event. For 15 years, her disappearance remained a mystery, and when the truth finally came out, it shocked and outraged everyone. Jessica Dishon was born on May 2nd, 1982. She grew up in a tight-knit community where most people worked in farming and everyone knew each other. She was the oldest of 3 children and helped care for her younger brothers from an early age while her parents worked. That made her independent and reliable, someone her family could always count on. By the time she was 15, Jessica had taken a part-time job at a local restaurant to save for her dream car, a red Pontiac. A few years later, she had the money and made it happen. Even with her job, she maintained excellent grades and had her sights set on college, where she planned to study accounting. In the fall of 1999, she started her senior year. She was 17, excited about the future, and had just begun dating a boy she liked. Everything seemed to be going well. Then came Friday, September 10th. That morning, Jessica's parents left for work while she was still asleep. Her brothers left for school as usual. Jessica stayed behind and was supposed to drive herself to class not long after. Around noon, her mother returned home and immediately knew something was off. Jessica's car was still in the driveway. By that time of day, she should have been at school. She went inside and checked Jessica's bedroom. Maybe she had overslept. But the room was empty. Maybe her father had driven her to school instead. She called him. No, he had gone to work alone that morning, thinking there might be something wrong with the car. Her mother grabbed the spare key and walked over to it. That's when she saw something that made her stomach drop. The driver's door was slightly ajar. Inside, Jessica's cell phone lay on the seat with 9 and 1 already dialed on the screen. One of her shoes and her keys were under the front seat. In the back were her textbooks, work uniform, and purse. It was clear. Jessica hadn't just gone somewhere. She'd left everything behind, mid-action. Something had interrupted her. Worried, the family called the school and found out Jessica had never shown up for class. But somehow, the school hadn't notified them. The tension grew. Later that day, Jessica's best friend from work called to say she hadn't shown up for her shift either. That's when her parents knew something was terribly wrong. They called the police. But the sheriff dismissed their fears, casually suggesting Jessica had probably wandered off and would come home soon. He didn't seem to care that she'd left behind her shoe, her phone with 911 half dialed, or all her belongings. Jessica's parents pleaded for an investigation, but the sheriff refused. They were left helpless, staring at an open car door and a trail that had already gone cold. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. But Brooks wasn't just a name in the background. His behavior after Jessica's disappearance quickly turned dark and unsettling. Before she went missing, Jessica's family had a perfectly normal relationship with him and his relatives. Nothing seemed out of place. But shortly after that day, Brooks began acting in ways that sent chills down their spines. He started driving past their house slowly, almost daily, locking eyes with the family through his window. But it wasn't just the stares. It was the strange, almost mocking smile he wore every time, like he knew something they didn't. Soon after, the family began receiving eerie phone calls. No one spoke on the other end, just heavy breathing, silent, menacing. Jessica's parents had a gut feeling it was Brooks, but why was he doing this? Things escalated when they saw him burning clothes on his property. That was the final straw. Once again, they went to the police, who, up until then, had barely lifted a finger to help. This time, they insisted on a proper search and brought cadaver dogs along, hoping Jessica's scent might still linger. Using Jessica's clothing to track her trail, the dogs led officers straight to Brooks's fire pit. It felt like a breakthrough, but there was no hard evidence. Nothing the police could use. Then, inside a nearby shed, the dogs hit on something else, a pair of black gloves, reeking of decomposition. Despite how suspicious it all looked, and Brooks's behavior growing stranger by the day, the police still claimed they couldn't tie him to Jessica's disappearance. Once again, the family was left in the dark. Frustrated and desperate, Jessica's father reached out to the FBI. Under normal circumstances, the Bureau doesn't get involved based on a phone call from a distraught family member. But this time, the details were disturbing enough to warrant immediate attention. The FBI took the case seriously. After reviewing the facts, they concluded that Jessica might not just be missing, something far worse could have happened. A full-scale investigation was launched, finally treating the case with the urgency it deserved. Agents combed through Jessica's room and car, collecting fingerprints and anything that might help. All of it was sent to the lab for analysis. They brought in helicopters and mobilized volunteers for a ground search. Even the pond near Jessica's home was drained and searched, in case it held a terrible secret. And then, back on Brooks's farm, FBI agents made a chilling discovery. Inside one of the sheds, they found a printed photo of Jessica. A photo. Just sitting there. It wasn't evidence of a crime on its own, but it was enough to make everyone's skin crawl. After the unsettling discovery of Jessica's photo in Brooks's shed, investigators became nearly certain he had something to do with her disappearance. Their suspicions didn't stop with him either. His 35-year-old brother, Joseph, also raised red flags. During the property search, Joseph acted nervous and evasive, his behavior tipping off detectives that he might be hiding something. But there was a problem. Despite the suspicious actions and disturbing finds, nothing they uncovered was solid enough to justify an arrest. No hard evidence. So unable to hold either of the brothers, investigators doubled down on searching the surrounding area, convinced they were now looking for Jessica's body. Not Jessica alive. Then, on September 27th, 17 days after she went missing, a breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A woman was driving near a river not far from where Jessica's father had desperately searched in the first few days. Just off the road, something odd caught her eye near a tree. Curious and uneasy, she stopped the car and walked closer. As she approached, it became clear. What she was looking at was human. Shaken, she called the police immediately. FBI agents arrived on scene and confirmed the worst. It was a body. A young woman, partially decomposed, missing fingers and parts of her limbs. Her legs had been tied with a rope that had traces of red and silver paint. Some of her clothing was missing, leading detectives to strongly suspect she'd been sexually assaulted. The body was in such poor condition that identification wasn't immediate. The agents went to Jessica's house and gently asked her parents if they could help identify her. Her father couldn't bring himself to see what had become of his daughter. Her mother, through unimaginable courage, agreed. At first, she wasn't sure. But then she saw it, a small butterfly tattoo in the exact same spot Jessica had hers. Her heart broke. Later, forensic experts confirmed the identity. It was Jessica. The autopsy revealed she had died from strangulation. But that wasn't the only horror. Her body was covered in bruises, and experts determined the mutilation, removal of her limbs and fingers, had occurred after death. It was brutal. But what crushed everyone involved was the final detail. Jessica had been alive for approximately 3 days after she disappeared. 3 days. That meant if the police had acted right away, when the car was found, when the shoe was discovered, when her phone had 911 dialed, they might have saved her. But they didn't. They dismissed it. And that failure cost Jessica her life. After Jessica's body was found, the FBI brought Brooks in for questioning once again. This time, they noticed something right away. His story had changed. During his first interview, Brooks said he saw Jessica near her house on the morning she disappeared. Now, suddenly, he claimed he hadn't seen her at all that day. Instead, he told investigators he was in bed with his wife that morning. But when they questioned her, she contradicted his alibi. From there, the inconsistencies kept piling up. FBI agents pressed harder. They asked Brooks what he would say if his fingerprints were found on Jessica's body. There were no such prints, but his answer was revealing. He said if that ever happened, he'd have no choice but to confess. It was a strange thing to say, especially for someone insisting on their innocence. Shortly after, he was given a polygraph test and failed. That was enough for the FBI to act. They arrested Brooks and prepared to bring him to trial. Still, they knew the case was on shaky ground. There was no direct evidence tying Brooks to the murder. Nothing definitive. Just a series of deeply suspicious actions, troubling inconsistencies, and an unsettling pattern of behavior. Investigators continued digging, desperate for anything that could strengthen their case. One detail came back to light. During the search of Brooks's vehicle, police had found a rope eerily similar to the one used to bind Jessica's legs. But again, no DNA. Nothing that could connect the rope directly to the crime. Just another circumstantial clue in a case built on shadows. In January 2003, the trial began. Brooks's attorney leaned heavily on the lack of physical evidence, arguing that suspicion wasn't enough to convict. He painted his client as a target of assumption, not proof. Then, a devastating revelation came out in court. When Jessica's body was discovered, investigators had also found her missing limbs nearby. These remains were carefully packed into labeled containers that clearly instructed law enforcement to refrigerate them to preserve any potential evidence, especially DNA. But the local police failed to follow that basic procedure. They left the boxes at room temperature. By the time they were examined, the tissue had decomposed so badly that any forensic value was gone. It was a critical mistake. Whatever evidence those containers may have held, fingerprints, skin cells, DNA from the killer, was lost forever. With no definitive evidence to support the prosecution's claims, jurors were left with unsettling clues, but no solid foundation. In the end, they couldn't agree on a unanimous verdict. Brooks walked free. Under state law, he couldn't be retried unless new evidence emerged. For Jessica's parents, it was crushing. In their hearts, they believed they knew who had taken their daughter's life. And worse still, they believed she could have been saved. If only the police had acted sooner. If only the system had cared more. In the end, they weren't just left without justice. They were left with nothing but loss. In the years that followed, Jessica Dishon's case faded into silence. It remained cold, unresolved, untouched, and eventually all but forgotten. Then, in 2012, a new detective named Lynn Hunt joined the local police department. She was assigned to take over unsolved cases, and one of the first files to land on her desk was Jessica's. From the moment she opened the case file, Hunt was stunned. The level of negligence shown by the original investigators was nothing short of outrageous. Reports were riddled with mistakes, crucial interviews were never documented, and the chain of evidence was a mess. It was like the case had never been properly investigated at all. In effect, Hunt had no choice but to start from scratch, 13 years after the murder. Her first move was to visit Jessica's family. One of Jessica's younger brothers, now grown and living on his own, gave Hunt a box filled with items from Jessica's car, objects the police had returned to the family years earlier. The fact that these items were ever handed back, without proper cataloging or preservation, floored her. Not only had crucial evidence been mishandled, but basic protocol had clearly been ignored. Even though so much time had passed, and most of the items were unlikely to yield anything useful, Hunt carefully examined every single one. She wasn't just chasing leads, she was rebuilding a case from ashes, and that's when she found something curious. Buried in the old reports was a copy of Brooks's medical evaluation. According to the records, his IQ was just 61, well below average. That revelation changed everything. It forced Hunt to question the legitimacy of the original interrogations. If Brooks truly had such a low level of comprehension, there was a real chance he hadn't fully understood the questions being asked. Maybe his bizarre behavior wasn't evidence of guilt, but a reflection of severe cognitive limitations. With that in mind, Hunt began to consider a possibility that hadn't been taken seriously before. Maybe Brooks hadn't killed Jessica at all. Maybe they'd spent all those years looking in the wrong direction, so she expanded her focus. She began digging into anyone who had lived nearby or had even the slightest connection to the case. She worked tirelessly, turning over every stone that her predecessors had ignored. Then, in September 2014, something unexpected happened. A fellow officer from a different department reached out to Hunt. An inmate in a Kentucky state prison had come forward with a shocking claim. He said he knew who had really killed Jessica Dishon. And just like that, after nearly 15 years, the case was suddenly alive again. Detective Lynn Hunt approached the new lead with caution. In her experience, jailhouse tips often led nowhere. Just stories made up by inmates hoping to score reduced sentences or better treatment behind bars. Still, something about this one felt different. She knew she couldn't afford to dismiss it without checking it out. So she made the trip to the prison and sat down with the inmate who had come forward. The man claimed that during his time in prison, he'd shared a cell with another inmate serving time for child abuse, just like him. They bonded over their shared charges and, over time, confided in each other about the crimes that had put them behind bars. And one day, his cellmate dropped a bombshell. He admitted to killing Jessica Dishon. The informant didn't hesitate. He gave Hunt the man's name. What she heard left her speechless. Stanley Dishon. Jessica's uncle, her father's own brother. According to the inmate, Stanley had confessed that he'd been sexually abusing Jessica for years while living in the same house as her family. He had threatened her, warning that if she ever told anyone, especially someone close, he would kill her, or worse. But in the spring of 1999, Jessica began dating someone. That changed everything. Stanley, paranoid and afraid she might open up to her boyfriend about the abuse, began to unravel. On the morning of September 10th, the day Jessica disappeared, Stanley showed up at the house, knowing she was alone. She was already outside getting into her car, her belongings packed for school and work. That's when Stanley confronted her, demanding she break off her relationship. Jessica refused. Not only that, she threatened to expose him if he didn't leave her alone. The situation escalated. Jessica reached for her phone to call 911, but Stanley lunged. She broke free and ran into the house. He chased her down, cornered her in her bedroom, hit her, and tied her up using her bedsheets. Then he carried her out, alive. Stanley took her to an old, abandoned shed not far from where her body would eventually be discovered. There, he held her captive for several days, during which she endured unthinkable abuse. Eventually, he killed her, leaving her body near the roadside to be found. He buried the sheets used to bind her beneath the floor of the shed. The most horrifying part? Stanley told his cellmate that after the murder, he mutilated Jessica's body, removing some of her limbs, in an effort to throw off investigators, to make it seem like the work of drug traffickers or someone involved in organized crime. As Hunt listened, her instincts sharpened. There was a detail the inmate shared that convinced her he wasn't making this up: the missing limbs. That fact had never been made public. Only Jessica's immediate family and a handful of investigators had ever known. There was no way he could have guessed it. And then came one last piece. The informant said Stanley told him he had buried one of Jessica's shoes under a broken tree near the shed. It was a chilling account. But more importantly, it was a story that might finally lead to justice. Detective Hunt knew she needed proof before confronting Jessica's family with the shocking allegations. The claims were too serious and too personal to act on without solid evidence. With staffing at the police department stretched thin, she couldn't rely on her colleagues for help. Instead, she turned to the only people she trusted with the search: Jessica's brother and a few close relatives. She kept the true reason for the dig to herself. No one knew yet that Stanley, their own family, was now the prime suspect. The first day of the search was grueling. Rain poured relentlessly as they dug through the mud, focusing on the locations the inmate had described. But the day ended with nothing to show for it, just wet clothes and frustration. Undeterred, Hunt returned the next day with Jessica's brother. As they drove, he pointed to an old, decaying barn on the roadside, one that matched the rough location given by the informant. They pulled over and started digging inside the structure. It didn't take long. Just beneath the surface, they unearthed what they had been desperately searching for: a buried bedsheet. Heart-pounding, Hunt carefully preserved the evidence and rushed to Jessica's childhood home. For over a decade, her parents had left Jessica's room untouched. Everything remained just as it was the day she vanished: pillows, books, and even the bedsheets. That preserved detail became crucial. Hunt brought the sheet into the room and compared it to the remaining bedding. It was a perfect match. The same pattern, the same fabric. And one sheet was clearly missing from Jessica's bed. It was the breakthrough she needed. Shortly after, Stanley Dishon was arrested. Brought in for questioning, he didn't confess, but something about him cracked. His usual composure faltered, and the fear in his eyes was undeniable. Though he maintained his innocence, the evidence was enough to charge him with Jessica's murder. The case was finally heading to court. For Jessica's father, it was a devastating revelation. At first, he couldn't accept it. The idea that his own brother, the man who stood beside him in the darkest days of the search, could have committed this unthinkable crime, was too much to process. But eventually, the pieces began to fall into place. He remembered something from those early days. Stanley had suggested searching the area near the river. But at one point during the search, Stanley suddenly claimed he wasn't feeling well and insisted on driving his brother home. What they didn't realize at the time was that they had been just a few hundred yards away from the barn, where Jessica's body would later be found. It now seemed clear. Stanley had deliberately steered them away from the discovery. Jessica had still been alive then, and her killer had been standing right beside them. As the trial drew closer, Detective Hunt intensified her efforts to build the strongest case possible. She began investigating Stanley Dishon's past, hoping to uncover anything that might support the prosecution. She already knew he had served time for assaulting another girl in the family, but what she found next was even more horrifying. Several women, all closely related to Stanley, came forward with nearly identical stories. They told the police that he had sexually abused them when they were young. The pattern was unmistakable. Stanley would tell his relatives he had nowhere to go and ask to stay with them temporarily. Then, once inside the home, once left alone with the girls, he would carry out his abuse. He kept them silent with threats. One by one, their testimonies revealed a dark truth. Stanley had been doing this for over 30 years. Despite the mounting testimonies, Hunt knew the murder trial would be a different battle. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing physical to directly tie Stanley to Jessica's death. The sheet was strong circumstantial evidence, but the defense could still argue it wasn't enough. Still, Hunt wasn't done searching. While combing through boxes of forgotten files, she stumbled across one that hadn't been opened in years. Inside was something that made her heart drop, a letter dated June 26, 2002. It was from another prison informant. A full 12 years before the Kentucky inmate came forward, this man had written to the police about Stanley's confession. At the time, Stanley was already in prison for sexually assaulting an underage relative. He had told his cellmate that he was responsible for Jessica's murder, describing in gruesome detail what he had done to his niece. And yet, nothing was done. The letter had been sent directly to the department handling Jessica's case. But the officers at the time, seemingly convinced that Brooks was the culprit, didn't even bother to follow up. They ignored it, discarded a potential confession because it didn't fit the narrative they'd already decided on. For Hunt, it was another bitter reminder of how catastrophically the case had been mishandled. If someone had just taken that letter seriously, justice might have come over a decade earlier. Jessica's family might have had answers. Instead, they endured years of silence and confusion, while the real killer sat quietly behind bars, confessing to strangers who were never believed. Now, after all this time, all Hunt could do was hope that the trial would finally bring justice. Delayed, but not denied, the trial finally began in 2015. Stanley Dishon stood before the court and pleaded not guilty. In the gallery, Jessica's parents sat frozen, unable to look directly at the man who had torn their lives apart. What made it worse was that Stanley still refused to admit what he had done. After all the years of silence, pain, and unanswered questions, he wouldn't even offer them the dignity of closure. Prosecutors faced a difficult road ahead. The case lacked direct evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA. Everything they had was circumstantial. Even the testimonies from other victims in the family posed a challenge. For those charges to stick, every woman would have to take the stand and recount, publicly and in graphic detail, what Stanley had done to them as children. So the prosecution made a strategic decision. They offered Stanley a plea deal. If he confessed to Jessica's murder and to the sexual abuse of multiple family members, they would remove the possibility of the death penalty. In the end, Stanley accepted. He entered a guilty plea, but he didn't have to explain himself. He wasn't required to share what exactly happened or why. That silence was devastating for Jessica's parents. They had hoped, at the very least, to hear the truth after so many years. But Stanley gave them nothing. Under the plea agreement, Stanley was sentenced to 20 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. He was 56 at the time. That meant he could walk free at 71. Jessica's father, numb with rage, made one promise after the trial. If his brother didn't die in prison, he would be waiting for him on the outside, to make sure justice was truly served. In 2019, Stanley gave a rare interview from prison and continued to deny everything. He insisted he didn't kill Jessica and claimed he'd been at work the morning she disappeared. But after 2 decades, there was no way to verify that claim. He offered no explanation for how 2 separate prison informants, who had never met, had shared nearly identical stories about his confession. Stories that included specific, never-released details, like where the bedsheet had been buried. And what about David Brooks? Though he was no longer the prime suspect, detectives never fully ruled out his possible role in the case. Brooks and Stanley had known each other. It's possible Stanley asked for help, perhaps not telling Brooks the full story. With his extremely low IQ, Brooks may not have grasped the gravity of what was happening. Maybe he was the one who burned Jessica's clothes. Maybe the gloves the dogs reacted to had been passed to him. Some investigators even theorized that Brooks had placed Jessica's photo in Stanley's shed, either out of confusion or in an attempt to deflect suspicion. But whatever Brooks knew, he took it with him to the grave. He died in 2021 from heart complications, and with him may have gone the last remaining pieces of the truth. One chilling detail often gets overlooked, but it's impossible to ignore. On the 3rd day after Jessica disappeared, her younger brother heard something outside, a voice, faint and distant, calling for help. He was convinced it was Jessica. To this day, no one knows what really happened in that moment. Maybe it was a child's mind, overwhelmed with fear and anxiety, imagining his sister's voice out of sheer desperation. Maybe it was someone else entirely. But there's also a version of events, unlikely as it seems, that still lingers in the background. Because right after the boy alerted his father and they rushed outside, Stanley drove up to the house. Just like that, he appeared. He claimed he had just come by to check in, but the timing was eerie. It placed him near the scene, right at the moment someone may have been screaming for help. Could Jessica have been in his car? Gagged, tied up, unconscious? It's hard to say. The idea seems far-fetched, but not impossible. If she was alive at that point, and the timeline suggests she may have been, then her cries could have been real, and Stanley, knowing her family was nearby, may have arrived to steer them away or control the situation. Or maybe the voice wasn't real at all, just an echo created by trauma. But the what-ifs still haunt those who remember that day. Because for a fleeting second, help might have been only a few feet away, and yet still out of reach. Share your thoughts on this story in the comment section. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Case 2. Rowan Ford, 2007, Missouri. Colleen had searched every corner of town, but there was still no trace of her daughter. With worry turning into panic, she returned home and told her husband, David, that Rowan was nowhere to be found. She urged him to call the police and report her missing, but David brushed off her concerns. He assured her that everything was fine. Rowan would show up soon, he said. But as the hours dragged on and there was still no sign of her, Colleen couldn't wait any longer. She picked up the phone herself and called 911. The local sheriff acted quickly, launching an official search. One of the first steps was visiting David, the last known person to see Rowan before she vanished. David recounted what he claimed happened that night. He said that while working on the farm with his colleague Christopher, their mutual friend Nathan showed up. The three decided to head to David's house, have a few drinks, and shoot some pool. On the way, they stopped at a store to pick up some alcohol, then went back to David's place and spent several hours hanging out. Later that night, Christopher wanted to return home to his trailer in a nearby town. He asked Nathan for a ride, and the two of them convinced David to tag along and keep the night going. Before leaving, David said he peeked in on Rowan. She was asleep in her room. With that, he left with his friends. They made another stop at a store for more alcohol, then drove to Christopher's trailer, where the drinking continued for about an hour. Eventually, David said he wanted to go home. Nathan offered to drive, but rather than taking the highway, he opted for the back roads. He'd had too much to drink and didn't want to risk running into the police. Once back, Nathan dropped him off, and David went straight to bed. But not long after, he said, Rowan came into his room. She asked if she could sleep over at a friend's house. Still half asleep and not thinking much of it, David agreed and drifted off again. That, according to him, was the last time he saw her. Police listened to David's account with a growing sense of unease. What stood out most was the sheer implausibility of his story. A 9-year-old girl supposedly woke him in the middle of the night, asked to sleep over at a friend's house, and he let her go. Without asking which friend, where they lived, or how she planned to get there. Something didn't sit right. The sheriff began to suspect that David wasn't telling the whole truth, or worse, that he might be directly involved in Rowan's disappearance. But suspicion wasn't enough. There was still no hard evidence. Officers searched the area relentlessly, continuing late into the night. Word of Rowan's disappearance spread fast, and it didn't take long for the entire community to rally together. In a town like Stella, with barely 150 residents, everyone knew each other, and everyone knew Rowan. People were used to leaving their doors unlocked and letting their kids roam freely, confident nothing bad could ever happen here. But now, with Rowan missing and no trace of her found, fear rippled through the town. What was once considered a quiet, safe corner of the world had suddenly become a place of unanswered questions and growing panic. By the end of the first day, there was still nothing. No sign of Rowan. No clue about where she might have gone. On November 4th, detectives visited the neighboring town to speak with Christopher. He confirmed every detail of David's timeline: the drinks, the visit to the trailer, and the ride home. But he also revealed something else. David hadn't reached out to him since that night. In fact, he had only just heard about Rowan going missing. That same day, the search widened. More volunteers joined in, combing through woods, ditches, and every inch of land around Stella. Still, not a single lead turned up. The following morning, the FBI stepped in. While local officers continued their boots-on-the-ground search, federal agents shifted focus to the most disturbing possibility: abduction. They were already skeptical of David's story. It didn't make sense for a child to vanish into the night without anyone noticing, and none of Rowan's friends had seen her or heard from her. Agents followed up with each of them, confirming without doubt that Rowan hadn't gone to any sleepover. The more they dug, the more David's version of events began to unravel, and with every passing hour, the urgency deepened, because the window to bring Rowan home safely was quickly closing. As investigators continued questioning David, more cracks began to appear in his story. He started changing certain details, sometimes contradicting himself entirely. One moment, he insisted Rowan had woken him up to ask if she could go to a friend's house. The next, he claimed she might have left without telling him at all. His timeline for that night shifted each time they asked, making it harder and harder to believe he was being truthful. Then came a detail that hadn't surfaced before. David had borrowed his mother's car the night Rowan vanished. He never mentioned it in his earlier statements. That revelation pushed the FBI to act. They seized both his pickup truck and the borrowed car for forensic analysis. But despite their hopes, the search turned up nothing. No physical evidence, no sign of Rowan. With pressure mounting and leads thinning, investigators circled back to the two men who had been with David that night, Christopher and Nathan. They asked Christopher to return to the station for further questioning. Once again, he stuck to the same story. He recounted the timeline, the drinks, the visit to the trailer. This time, he agreed to take a polygraph test, which showed no signs of deception. At least on the surface, his story held up. But then, something unexpected happened. Later that day, after leaving the station and returning to work, Christopher spotted a familiar vehicle, Sheriff Clark's patrol car. He flagged him down. Sheriff Clark, who led the police department in the neighboring town of Wheaton, had known Christopher for nearly 2 decades. He was friends with Christopher's foster parents and had watched him grow up. Over the years, Christopher had come to see him as a trusted figure, someone he could turn to during hard times, especially after his mother died. Clark pulled over, and the two began talking about Rowan's disappearance. Though the sheriff wasn't officially involved in the investigation, he had been following the case. As they spoke, Clark couldn't shake a strange feeling. Something about Christopher's demeanor was off. He didn't seem like himself. It wasn't just nervousness. There was something deeper, something evasive. Trusting his instincts and knowing how high the stakes were, Sheriff Clark didn't brush it off. He contacted the FBI and shared his suspicions. There was a growing sense that Christopher might be hiding something, and time was running out to find out what it was. Sheriff Clark didn't waste any time. He contacted the FBI agents handling the case and shared his concerns about Christopher. Investigators began to suspect that Christopher might be holding back critical information, possibly to protect David. They theorized that Rowan's stepfather may have pressured him into lying or altering parts of his story, and now Christopher was afraid that telling the truth might make him look like an accomplice. Given Clark's long-standing relationship with Christopher, he offered to help. He believed he could convince him to open up, and the agents agreed. That same evening, Christopher unexpectedly showed up at Colleen's house. He said he wanted to see if there had been any updates in the search for Rowan. Around that time, the FBI also arrived to speak with Colleen again. When they saw Christopher there, they decided to take the opportunity to ask him a few more questions. At first, he repeated the same version of events he'd already given, word for word. But then, for the first time, something shifted. Christopher admitted he no longer felt sure about David's innocence. He said it was entirely possible David had something to do with Rowan's disappearance, and claimed he was ready to help uncover the truth, no matter how disturbing it might be. He even went so far as to volunteer to wear a wire and confront David in hopes of getting him to confess. But the FBI decided against it. They didn't want to risk compromising the case or Christopher's safety. Instead, they asked if he had any idea where David might have hidden Rowan's body, any places that stood out based on what he knew. Christopher gave them a short list of locations he thought were worth checking. The next morning, search teams were dispatched to those spots, while others continued scouring the surrounding areas around Stella. Meanwhile, the FBI brought David in once more for questioning. But just like before, he flatly denied having anything to do with Rowan's disappearance. No emotion, no change in story. Just cold, unwavering denial. Detectives conducted a thorough search of David's home, hoping to uncover something, anything, that might point them in the right direction. But the house turned up nothing. No clues, no evidence. Meanwhile, Christopher made his way to the sheriff's office to speak with Sheriff Clark. He shared details of his recent interaction with the FBI, but as they talked, Clark couldn't shake the feeling that Christopher was still holding something back. After the meeting, Clark called the FBI again. He told them he believed Christopher was sitting on information that could finally tie David to Rowan's disappearance. The agents agreed. They had also gotten the sense that Christopher wanted to say more, but was hesitating, possibly out of fear, or guilt, or a twisted sense of loyalty. They asked the sheriff to keep pressing him, to keep the door open. Then, on November 7th, investigators called Christopher back to the station. They needed his permission to search a safe he had left inside David's house. Christopher had been staying there for a while when he didn't have a place of his own, and some of his things were still stored there. He gave them full consent without hesitation. He also agreed to let officers search his own trailer and car. He even voluntarily submitted a DNA sample. Everything he did seemed cooperative, almost eager, as if he wanted to clear himself. The detectives brought him in for another round of questioning. Once again, they walked through the timeline of that night and asked him to confirm David's version of events. But this time, something changed. Christopher admitted that David's story wasn't completely true. It was a breakthrough. Finally, a crack in the wall of silence. Detectives pressed harder, urging him to tell them what really happened that night. But instead of opening up, Christopher grew increasingly tense. The more they pushed, the more defensive he became. Eventually, he snapped. He told them that if they were going to treat him like a suspect, if they were trying to pin this on him, then he wasn't going to say another word. The interview came to an abrupt end. Christopher stood up and walked out of the station. And just like that, the truth slipped through their fingers. Again, that same evening, Christopher returned to Sheriff Clark's office, visibly shaken. He recounted what had happened during the interrogation and said he felt like the detectives were treating him as if he were a suspect. He admitted he was now thinking about hiring a lawyer. Clark calmly reminded him that he had every right to do so, but also urged him to understand that the investigators were simply doing everything in their power to bring Rowan home. Christopher sighed, then stated firmly that he was done talking to the FBI or local police. If he decided to say anything more, he would only speak with Clark. No one else. The sheriff saw his chance and didn't let it pass. He gently continued urging Christopher to share what he knew, reminding him that time was running out. As the conversation deepened, Christopher's composure finally cracked. His eyes welled up with tears, and he broke down. He swore he loved Rowan, that he would never hurt her. While living in David's house, he had grown close to the children. Rowan and her siblings had started calling him Uncle Christopher. To them, he was part of the family. Clark could see it. Christopher was right on the edge of telling him everything. But just as he was about to speak, someone else walked into the station, pulling the sheriff away momentarily. When Clark returned, Christopher was gone. Whatever he had been about to confess vanished with him. Still, Clark had heard enough to believe Christopher was ready to break. He contacted the FBI and explained what had happened. Christopher was closer than ever to revealing the truth. But any more pressure could cause him to shut down completely and bring in a lawyer. The agents agreed to back off, at least for the time being. They'd wait and see if Christopher would come back on his own. The search for Rowan resumed the next day, stretching across the area with growing urgency, but still, no results. Then, on November 9th, exactly 1 week after she disappeared, everything changed. Search teams had pushed farther out, into a remote patch of land near the small town of Powell, about 10 miles from Stella. Deep in the woods, hidden among tall grass and trees, they came across a large pit in the ground. Inside, under a covering of leaves and scattered debris, lay the body of 9-year-old Rowan. The search was over. But now, the real nightmare was just beginning. Rowan's body told a horrifying story. She was found without any clothing below the waist, except for a single sock. The medical examiner confirmed what everyone feared. She had been strangled and sexually assaulted. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community, and the case was now officially a homicide. Shortly after the body was recovered, the FBI reached out to Sheriff Clark. They asked him to try once more to speak with Christopher, hoping that the grim news might finally push him to come clean. But when Clark arrived at the station, he was told that Christopher had already been there earlier that morning, looking for him. He told the officers it was urgent, but Clark had been out at the time. Worried, the sheriff started searching for him, checking every place he thought Christopher might go, but he was nowhere to be found. Hours passed until finally, Clark's phone rang. It was Christopher. He sounded shaken and paranoid. His first question was whether anyone was following him. He explained that after hearing the news about Rowan, he had been driving around trying to clear his head, until he noticed a gray car behind him. It followed him for miles, and now he was convinced someone was watching him. He feared not only being blamed for the murder, but that someone might come after him to get revenge. Clark reassured him, saying he wasn't aware of any surveillance, and urged him to meet face to face. Christopher agreed. When they met, it was immediately clear that something had changed. Christopher was on edge, restless, pacing, his eyes darting. He told Clark he was scared of being accused, scared of what might happen to him. Clark listened, then told him gently, now that the case had officially become a homicide, it was time to stop running. He needed to tell the truth. He needed to tell them what David had done to Rowan. Christopher broke down again. He was crying, trembling. But instead of answering, he hesitated and looked around nervously. He said there were too many people at the station and that he didn't want to talk there. Instead, he proposed driving to a quiet spot, a small, secluded bridge a few miles outside town. Clark agreed, and they drove together in silence. When they arrived and stepped out of the car, Christopher did something unexpected. He raised his hands and turned to the sheriff. "You should cuff me," he said. Clark looked at him, startled. "That won't be necessary." But Christopher shook his head. "After what I tell you, you'll have to." And then, Christopher began to talk. At first, he repeated the same version of events he'd given police countless times. He, Nathan, and David had gone to his trailer that night, continued drinking, and eventually David asked Nathan for a ride home. They agreed to take the back roads to avoid police, and then left. But what came next stunned Sheriff Clark. Christopher took a shaky breath and admitted that everything changed the moment his friends left. He confessed that he had been harboring a dark, twisted intent. He wanted to sexually assault Rowan. And that night, he acted on it. Knowing David and Nathan would take the long route through the fields, Christopher jumped in his car and sped down the main highway straight to David's house. He got there ahead of them, slipped inside, and crept into Rowan's room. Without waking her, he picked her up and carried her to his car. He brought her back to his trailer and once there, carried out the assault. According to him, Rowan woke up during the attack and struggled, trying to resist. But she was too small to escape. Christopher said he never turned on the lights and never spoke a word. He didn't want her to recognize him. Afterward, he claimed he had intended to return her home quietly and leave her there, hoping no one would ever know what had happened. But the plan fell apart the moment he stepped outside with her in his arms. The moonlight was bright, and for just a second, Rowan saw his face. That was when panic took over. In a blind rush to silence her, he grabbed a rope and strangled her right there. When she stopped breathing, he placed her body in his car and began driving with no real plan, just terror. He thought about dumping her off the bridge, right where they now stood, but decided against it. The water was too shallow, and the body would be found quickly. So he drove aimlessly, circling through the county, until he remembered an old pit near a neighboring town. That would have to do. He drove to the spot, dragged Rowan's body to the edge, and pushed her in. He tried to cover her with leaves and branches, but the pit was deep and wide. As he covered her, everything just kept sliding down, refusing to stay in place. In the end, she was left partially exposed, but it didn't matter to him. He got back in his car and drove away, believing the nightmare might stay buried. But now, standing on that same bridge, he knew it wouldn't. When Christopher returned to his trailer after disposing of Rowan's body, he realized there were still traces of what he had done, blood on his clothes and on the mattress. Panic set in again. He knew he had to get rid of everything: her pants, underwear, and the rope he'd used to kill her. He gathered it all and shoved the items into a large metal barrel, intending to burn the evidence. But as he lit the fire, the flames grew higher than expected, and he quickly realized that the thick smoke and intense heat would likely draw attention. Thinking fast, he dragged the barrel into his shed, shut the door, and continued the fire in secret, hidden from view. Sheriff Clark stood in stunned silence. Up until that moment, he had believed David was the likely culprit, and that Christopher was simply protecting him, caught in a web of misplaced loyalty. But now, listening to this full confession, he realized the truth was far worse than he could have imagined. Christopher wasn't a bystander. He was the monster behind it all. It was hard for Clark to process. He had known Christopher for nearly 20 years. The man had always come across as dependable, even likable. He had 3 children of his own. Though he no longer lived with them after a divorce, Clark had never seen any warning signs. No clue that this man was capable of something so brutal, so calculated. When Christopher finished, he agreed to turn himself in without resistance. Clark didn't even handcuff him. They drove back to the station together. Once there, Christopher repeated everything he had told the sheriff to the FBI agents. That was when they formally arrested him for the murder of Rowan. He also signed a consent form allowing investigators to search both his trailer and his vehicle. Before the conversation ended, he added one more detail: that he'd cried uncontrollably the day after the killing, saying he couldn't stop weeping. But no amount of tears could undo what he had done. Detectives wasted no time. With Christopher in custody, they turned their attention to David. Given his bizarre behavior from the start and the way his story kept shifting, they suspected he hadn't been entirely truthful and possibly had helped cover up for his friend. But when they confronted him with the news of Christopher's confession, what David told them next turned the investigation upside down once again. When David was brought in for questioning again, detectives were blindsided by what he said. His story took a sudden, disturbing turn. This time, David claimed that when he returned home and found Rowan missing, a sickening suspicion crept in. He believed Christopher might have taken her. So without saying anything to anyone, he borrowed his mother's car and drove straight to the trailer. What he said he found there was horrifying. According to David, he walked in and saw Rowan lying on the bed, with Christopher leaning over her. But instead of intervening, instead of stopping the nightmare in front of him, David claimed he chose to participate. He said he too assaulted Rowan, and afterward helped Christopher kill her and dispose of the body. He explained that his mind had completely shut down during the entire ordeal, and that he didn't remember anything clearly until days later. The detectives, already shaken by Christopher's confession, were stunned once again. If what David was saying was true, the crime had been even more monstrous than they initially believed. They went back to Christopher to confront him with David's claim, but Christopher denied it outright. He insisted David had nothing to do with the crime and stuck firmly to the original story he had told both Sheriff Clark and the FBI. According to him, he acted alone. The contradiction baffled investigators, but when they weighed both accounts against the physical evidence, Christopher's version appeared more consistent. Medical examiners confirmed that Rowan had been strangled with a thin rope, a detail that had never been made public, and one that Christopher had mentioned without prompting. During the search of his trailer, police found a barrel of ashes just as he described. In his car, investigators also recovered a strand of hair matching Rowan's. Still, the truth remained murky. 2 men, 2 confessions, each placing the blame squarely on himself, but both had now admitted to crimes that could not be ignored. With both men offering incriminating statements, the authorities had no choice. David was arrested as well, and charges were filed against them both. The case was turned over to the courts, where the full, twisted truth would have to be unraveled before a judge and jury. During the trial, Christopher tried to walk back everything. He filed a motion to have his statements excluded from the case, claiming he hadn't realized they could be used against him and that his rights had been violated during questioning. But the judge rejected the motion outright. Every conversation he had with investigators had been voluntary, with no coercion, no pressure, just a man choosing to talk. Desperate to avoid the harshest punishment, Christopher's defense attempted to paint a picture of a broken man shaped by a traumatic past. He'd been bounced between biological and foster homes as a child, never having a stable family, and his lawyers argued that this left deep emotional scars. An expert testified that he showed signs of developmental issues, but none of it mattered. In 2012, 5 years after Rowan's murder, Christopher was sentenced to death. He appealed the decision, but every attempt failed. The court stood by its ruling. David's case, however, was far more tangled. He had openly confessed to assaulting and killing Rowan, yet his version of events directly contradicted Christopher's. That contradiction posed a serious legal dilemma. If prosecutors formally charged David with murder, they risked unraveling Christopher's conviction. And if David stood trial and his version was accepted, Christopher's death sentence could be overturned. On top of that, there was no physical evidence tying David to the crime. No DNA, no witnesses, no forensic proof. The prosecution couldn't afford to gamble with such high stakes, though they didn't rule out the possibility that David had been involved, perhaps even acted alongside Christopher. There was no hard evidence to support that theory. In the end, they made a difficult and controversial call. To preserve the case against Christopher, they reduced David's charges. He pled guilty to 2 lesser offenses: child endangerment and obstruction of justice. For that, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison, with a minimum of 5 years before he'd be eligible for release. The public reaction was furious. If David had truly taken part in Rowan's murder, then his sentence was a gross miscarriage of justice. 11 years for a child's life was, to many, unimaginable. But legally, the case had reached a dead end. Without solid proof, there was little more that could be done, and the odds of David ever being retried were slim to none. As for Christopher, he remains on death row. But like many inmates sentenced to die, his execution may never actually happen. With years, sometimes decades, of legal delays and appeals, there's a strong chance he will spend the rest of his life behind bars, haunted by the crime that shocked an entire community. Share your thoughts on this story in the comment section. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Case 3. Jessica K.N., 1996, Florida. Jessica K.N. was born on June 22, 1986, in the peaceful city of Altamonte Springs, Florida. She grew up in a close-knit family with an older brother, a younger sister, and 2 devoted parents. Her father worked in construction, often traveling out of state for several days at a time, leaving the kids in the care of their mother. Jessica was the heart of the family, a cheerful, curious, and kind-hearted child. She loved animals, enjoyed playing outside with her friends and siblings, and always seemed to bring joy wherever she went. On April 5, 1996, just a few days before Easter, the family was busy preparing for a visit to Jessica's grandparents. That afternoon, her father left to pick up a few things from the store for the holiday, while her mother stayed behind in their apartment to pack for the trip. Around the same time, Jessica arrived home from school with a group of neighborhood kids. Eager to wait for her dad, she asked her mom if she could go outside and sit in the yard. Her mother agreed, reminding her not to leave the complex. Their apartment building sat back from the main road, surrounded by trees and open space. It was the kind of place where kids played freely, without the need for constant adult supervision. Jessica had spent countless afternoons out there with friends, and nothing had ever gone wrong, until that day. Around 6 p.m., her father returned from the store and asked his wife where Jessica was. Her answer was immediate and confused. "She's outside waiting for you." But he shook his head. Jessica wasn't there. Panic set in fast. They rushed outside, scanning the entire yard, calling her name. But Jessica was nowhere to be found. Hoping for some clue, they knocked on neighbors' doors. One neighbor confirmed having seen Jessica earlier, sitting on a bench, reading a book. But beyond that, no one had seen her leave or noticed anything unusual. As night began to fall, fear turned into dread. Jessica was still missing, and the worst-case scenarios started creeping in. They called the police. Officers arrived within minutes and immediately began canvassing the area, questioning neighbors and searching the surrounding streets. Hours passed with no sign of the girl. Then, just as everyone began fearing the trail had gone cold, a call came into the police station, one that would take the case in an unexpected direction. The voice on the other end of the line was barely audible, drowned out by loud background noise. But the message was clear enough to send chills through the 911 operator. The missing girl could be found near a water pumping station, just a few miles from her home. Police responded immediately, racing to the location described in the call. What they found was devastating. Beneath a bridge, tucked away from view and just yards from the road, lay a black trash bag. Inside was the lifeless body of 9-year-old Jessica K.N. Scattered nearby were a few children's items, some magazines and a small mirror. The spot was isolated and concealed. From the road above, there was no way anyone could have seen what was hidden below. It was only because of the anonymous tip that she was found at all. Jessica's body was turned over to the medical examiner for autopsy, while investigators scrambled to trace the call that had led them there. It was almost certainly made by the killer, and police hoped it might provide the break they needed. But tracking the call proved difficult. It had come from a payphone at a gas station less than a mile from the dumping site. By the time officers arrived, the caller was long gone. Detectives dusted the phone for prints, but it was a long shot. Being a public payphone, it had been touched by countless people. Any prints left behind were either useless or possibly wiped away. It was entirely likely the caller had worn gloves or cleaned the phone before walking off into the night. The crime scene itself offered few answers. Investigators quickly determined that Jessica hadn't been killed there. She had been transported post-mortem. The ground in front of the pumping station showed drag marks, clear signs that the trash bag had been pulled from a vehicle and dragged toward the structure. Jessica's clothing was mostly intact, except for one missing shoe, which wasn't found in or around the bag. Police searched the area thoroughly, but it had vanished. As for physical evidence, only one thing stood out: a tire track in the dirt. Whether it belonged to the killer's vehicle or not was unclear, but officers documented it carefully, took photographs, and made a cast. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in a case this disturbing, even the smallest detail could be the key to everything. The autopsy revealed a grim but clear cause of death. Jessica had been strangled. The marks on her neck and face showed that the killer had used their bare hands, which pointed to something intensely personal and emotionally driven. Inside her stomach, medical examiners found an unexpected clue: a partially digested hamburger, eaten less than an hour before she died. When police asked her mother about it, she confirmed Jessica hadn't eaten anything like that at home. That detail suggested one disturbing possibility: the killer had fed her. Despite the brutal nature of the crime, there were no signs of sexual assault, which left detectives grasping for answers. If not for abuse or revenge, what was the motive? Initially, suspicion turned toward Jessica's own parents. Neither of them had a confirmed alibi at the exact time she vanished. Her mother said she was inside packing for their trip, and her father was at the store. But in theory, both had the time and opportunity to commit the crime. Detectives were forced to consider every possibility. One lingering question haunted the investigation: how did someone manage to abduct a 9-year-old girl from a public yard in daylight, without anyone seeing or hearing a thing? There were no signs of a struggle, no screams. That led police to believe the killer likely knew Jessica. Someone she trusted. Someone she would have followed willingly. And then there was the 911 call. Despite the heavy noise that muffled the voice, experts tried cleaning up the audio as much as possible. What emerged was unsettling. The caller didn't sound threatening or mocking. Instead, the voice carried a tone of sorrow. Regret. Whoever made that call didn't sound like someone reveling in their crime. They sounded broken. It was a risk to place that call. It could have led to arrest. So why do it? Detectives considered two theories. Either the killer got some twisted satisfaction from toying with police, or, far more likely, he was overwhelmed with guilt and wanted, on some level, to be found. Given the emotional weight in the voice, investigators leaned toward the latter. Whoever killed Jessica hadn't set out to vanish into the shadows. He wanted someone to know where she was, and maybe, just maybe, he wanted to confess, without having to face it. During the early phase of the investigation, police turned their attention to Jessica's father and inspected his car for anything suspicious. In the trunk, they discovered something that instantly caught their attention: a roll of black trash bags that looked eerily similar to the one used to conceal Jessica's body. For a moment, it felt like a potential breakthrough, but that lead faded just as quickly as it appeared. Forensic specialists analyzed the trash bag from the crime scene and compared it with the roll from the father's vehicle. Their conclusion was clear. The bags didn't match. The one used to wrap Jessica came from a different batch, likely a different brand altogether. That ruled him out, for now, and police began redirecting their attention elsewhere. Meanwhile, forensic teams meticulously combed through Jessica's clothing and body, searching for any overlooked detail, and soon they found several promising clues. One of the most notable discoveries was a significant amount of dog hair on her clothing. Jessica's family didn't own a dog, which meant the hair likely came from someone else, the killer. Investigators also found strands of human hair, later confirmed to belong to an unidentified white male. It would take a few days to process the DNA, but it was a start. Further examination of Jessica's clothes revealed two types of foreign fibers. Forensic analysis identified one as most likely from a car seat cover and the other from a carpet. These fibers aligned with what detectives already suspected, that Jessica had been killed somewhere else and then transported to the pumping station. The dog hair in particular became a focal point of the investigation. Investigators turned to an unusual but highly specialized tool, the FBI's dog hair database. It contained microscopic photographs and characteristics of various breeds collected specifically to assist in criminal cases. One by one, they began eliminating breeds, comparing the structure of the recovered hair against those in the system. Eventually, the match came back. Shar-Pei. It was a significant detail. The killer either lived with or had been in close contact with a Shar-Pei. The hair likely transferred to Jessica's clothing, either while she was in their home or inside their vehicle. It wasn't a name. It wasn't an address. But it was something solid to build on. And in a case where leads were scarce, even a single strand of hair could point the way forward. Investigators began forming a preliminary theory. The killer likely lured Jessica into his car, took her to a fast food place, possibly McDonald's, for a hamburger, and then brought her to his home, where he ultimately took her life. At the same time, technicians continued working to enhance the original 911 call, but the poor audio quality made things difficult. So detectives decided to try a new angle. They reached out to NASA. Known for their highly advanced audio processing technology, originally developed to clean up recordings from deep space missions, NASA agreed to assist. Soon after, they returned a significantly enhanced version of the call. Even with the clearer recording, there was still a problem. They needed a sample voice to compare it against. Without a suspect, that wasn't possible. But detectives remembered one important assumption. The killer probably knew Jessica. So they played the enhanced call for someone who might recognize the voice, Jessica's mother. She listened carefully. At first, she couldn't place it. The voice stirred something in her memory, but she couldn't connect it to a name. Then, during a second playback, something clicked. She froze. The voice belonged to their neighbor. She couldn't recall his name, but she knew one thing for sure. He walked a Shar-Pei around the yard almost daily. That was all police needed. They quickly identified the neighbor as 35-year-old James Crow. He had already been interviewed early in the investigation, along with other nearby residents. At the time, Crow said he'd seen Jessica playing outside while walking his dog. They'd exchanged a few words, and then he continued on his way. Now, with the dog hair on Jessica's clothes matching the Shar-Pei breed, the voice recognition from her mother, and Crow's quiet proximity to the crime, the pieces were starting to align. Digging into Crow's background, detectives found no criminal record. He lived with his wife, a nurse, and had previously worked as a truck driver. At the time of Jessica's disappearance, he was unemployed and spent most of his days walking the streets with his dog, an unmistakable Shar-Pei named Pumpkin. What once looked like a dead-end neighborly interaction was now under the microscope, and James Crow, once just a face in the crowd, had suddenly become the prime suspect in the murder of Jessica K.N. Detectives knew they needed more than just a familiar voice and the coincidence of owning a Shar-Pei to justify an arrest. So they pursued a search warrant for James Crow's car, hoping something tangible might finally surface. What they found raised more than a few alarms. Tucked under the front passenger seat was an empty Happy Meal bag. It might have seemed harmless in another context, but considering Jessica had a McDonald's hamburger in her stomach when she died, and Crow didn't have children, the discovery felt ominously out of place. That wasn't all. Investigators also noticed that the car had brand new tires, so new they looked almost untouched. It turned out Crow had replaced them on the very day Jessica was murdered. But his previous set, according to mechanics, was still in decent shape and could have lasted him several more years. The timing felt too convenient to ignore. When questioned, Crow claimed he'd left the old tires behind at the car service shop. It was an unusual move, but officers followed up immediately. By the time they got there, only one tire remained from his original set. They rushed to compare its tread pattern with the impression found near the water pumping station where Jessica's body had been discovered. But then came a curveball. The tread didn't match. For a moment, the investigation hit a snag. The tire track at the crime scene had always been circumstantial. It wasn't guaranteed to belong to the killer. Other vehicles, including those used by maintenance workers, frequently passed through the area. Still, the timing of Crow's tire change and the disposal of nearly the entire old set left detectives uneasy. They continued with a search of his apartment. Inside, they uncovered something that seemed more than coincidental. A box filled with rolls of black trash bags. The same size, same color, same texture as the one used to conceal Jessica's body. But even that posed a problem. Trash bags like these were mass-produced by the thousands. They bore no serial numbers, no identifying marks. How could anyone prove the bag found with Jessica had come from this exact box? At first glance, it looked like another dead end. Yet somewhere in that box of plastic and doubt, investigators believed the answer might still be hiding, waiting for science to catch up. Even the detectives didn't expect what came next. Faced with the challenge of connecting two seemingly ordinary trash bags, forensic experts turned to a surprising source. N.L. Roberts, the man in charge of quality control at the company that manufactured the bags found in James Crow's apartment. Roberts quickly identified the factory of origin by examining a code printed on the cardboard box that housed the rolls. That small marking revealed the bags had been produced at a facility in Virginia. But what truly stunned investigators was how deep the analysis could go. Roberts explained that during the production process, a minute amount of iron or titanium is added to the plastic, depending on the bag's color. Since the factory produces bags in various shades, the raw material composition is in constant flux. The ratios of plastic to metal content vary slightly day by day, tiny shifts that occur naturally due to the difficulty in measuring such microscopic amounts with perfect precision. Manufacturers don't track these fluctuations because they fall well within acceptable limits, but scientists can. Using high-intensity X-rays, forensic experts measured the precise ratio of iron and titanium in the plastic of both the crime scene bag and the ones from Crow's apartment. The results were shocking. The chemical composition matched exactly. Not just close, identical. This meant the two bags were produced on the same day, likely in the same batch. But it didn't stop there. Roberts also revealed something even more fascinating. During manufacturing, microscopic debris builds up on the machines that press and cut the plastic. This debris is completely normal and allowed by production standards, but it leaves streaks across the material. When the plastic sheets are rolled and cut into bags, these streaks form distinct, visible patterns. And just like a fingerprint, the pattern is unique to each small section of fabric. Because the debris on the conveyor belt is always shifting, falling off and being replaced, any specific pattern only lasts for a few hundred feet of plastic at most. By examining the streaks on the bag from the crime scene and comparing them with bags from Crow's apartment, investigators could tell with surprising precision the two bags weren't just from the same batch. They were produced within a few hours of each other, maybe even minutes. It was the kind of forensic detail no one saw coming. And for detectives, it was the scientific proof they desperately needed. Connecting James Crow's home to the final moments of Jessica Cahen's life, experts continued their meticulous comparison between the trash bags found in James Crow's apartment and the one recovered from the crime scene. And the results were remarkable. The faint streaks left behind during the manufacturing process aligned with almost perfect precision. But the forensic team wasn't done yet. They explained that after the plastic is produced, the bags are rolled by a machine into bundles. Though the rolls may appear smooth to the naked eye, close inspection of the bag edges reveals something else entirely. Tiny folds and creases created by the uneven rolling process. Much like the production streaks, these subtle patterns are unique to each section of plastic and rarely repeat. Think of it as another fingerprint, but one made of folds. When they compared those creases, the experts were once again stunned. The pattern from the crime scene bag matched the bags from James's apartment. Not only did this confirm the bags came from the same production run, but further analysis revealed that they were separated by no more than 17 boxes in the factory line. Statistically, that meant the killer had almost certainly taken the bag from one of the rolls in Crow's possession. But the evidence didn't stop there. Forensic analysts then examined the two unidentified fibers found on Jessica's clothing. One matched the carpet in Crow's apartment. The other matched the seat covers of his car. It was yet another piece tying the victim to the suspect's home and vehicle. Finally, a sound analysis expert ran a voice comparison between the enhanced 911 call and a recorded sample of James's voice. The conclusion was definitive. The voices matched. The person who made the call to report Jessica's body was, without doubt, James Crow. Despite this mountain of findings, detectives faced a frustrating reality. Every bit of it was still technically circumstantial. There was no confession, no eyewitness, no DNA directly placing Crow at the scene of the crime. But the case they had built was rock solid. scientifically precise and damning from every angle. Convinced they had their man, authorities arrested James Crow. As news of the arrest spread, the prosecution announced its intention to pursue the death penalty. After years of haunting mystery, it looked like Jessica K.N.'s killer would finally face justice. With James Crow refusing to admit guilt, the case moved forward to trial. The prosecution laid out their theory in front of the court, painting a chilling yet calculated picture of how the crime unfolded. James was a familiar face in the neighborhood. He spent countless hours outside with his Shar-Pei, Pumpkin, and every kid in the apartment complex knew him. Most had played with the dog at some point. That familiarity made him seem harmless, trustworthy. Jessica, like the others, never had a reason to be afraid of him. According to investigators, it started innocently. James saw Jessica sitting alone on a bench that afternoon and approached her during one of his routine walks. They believed he struck up a conversation and offered to take her to McDonald's, promising a hamburger. And because she knew him, Jessica agreed. After their stop at the restaurant, prosecutors theorized he brought her back to the apartment complex, but instead of letting her go home, he lured her into his apartment. Maybe he said she could play with Pumpkin again. Maybe he had something else in mind. His wife was away at work, and the apartment was empty. The presence of carpet fibers from his living room on Jessica's clothes strongly suggested she had been inside that day. Detectives believed James attempted to assault her, but something went wrong. The forensic report was clear. Jessica had been strangled by hand, and at some point, a palm was forcefully pressed against her face. Perhaps she panicked, tried to scream, and he reacted violently in a desperate attempt to silence her. In that moment, the situation spiraled out of control. After she died, James placed her in a trash bag, likely one from his own supply, to discreetly carry her body to his car. Under the cover of dusk, he drove several miles to a remote water pumping station, dumped the bag just out of view, then made the anonymous 911 call from a nearby gas station. Minutes later, he returned home as if nothing had happened. In pre-trial hearings, Crow's defense team attacked the prosecution's case point by point. They argued that all the evidence was circumstantial: dog hair, carpet fibers, trash bags, voice analysis. Nothing placed James at the scene during the exact time of the murder. No eyewitnesses, no confession, no DNA. The judge allowed the case to proceed, but the defense wasn't wrong. In a capital trial where the death penalty was on the table, the burden of proof had to meet an even higher threshold. And while the evidence was compelling, it wasn't absolute. There remained a very real chance that James Crow could escape the harshest sentence the law allowed. Given the challenges of the case and the circumstantial nature of the evidence, prosecutors offered James Crow a plea deal. If he agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder, he would avoid the death penalty and instead serve 40 years in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a heavy sentence, but still far from what Jessica's parents had hoped for. In the summer of 1998, 2 years after Jessica's murder, James accepted the offer. Under the agreement, he wasn't required to explain what happened or give any further details about the crime. He maintained his silence. Still, he made one brief comment before the deal was finalized. James claimed his decision was partly motivated by a desire to spare Jessica's family from reliving their pain in court. He said he didn't want to put them through the agony of a public trial. Whether that was true or not, prosecutors believed there was a degree of genuine remorse. They pointed back to the strange, sorrowful 911 call that had first led them to Jessica's body. Its purpose was never fully understood, but in light of everything, they saw it as a sign of guilt and perhaps a desperate need to unburden himself. For Jessica's parents, the deal was a bitter pill. They had hoped for the ultimate punishment. They wanted answers, a confession, closure. Instead, James Crow walked into prison without ever explaining what he did or why. But even that punishment didn't last. In November 2011, James died in prison at the age of 49 due to health complications. Whatever secrets he held, the truth about what really happened that day, died with him. Jessica's case left behind a legacy of meticulous and groundbreaking forensic work. The investigation was a masterclass in patience and scientific precision. The revelations, pulled from something as ordinary as a trash bag, stunned everyone in the courtroom. Even the judge admitted he had never seen anything like it in his entire career. It was a case where tiny, overlooked details became the voice for a child who never got to speak for herself. Share your thoughts on this story in the comment section. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Case 4. Cayenne Polton, 1994, New York. Cayenne Polton was born on September 20th, 1989, in Rochester, New York, an only child surrounded by love. Her parents doted on her, and though their marriage ended when Kay was just 3 years old, her father remained a constant presence in her life. After the divorce, Kay stayed with her mother, Judy, who moved into a quiet suburban apartment complex in Rochester. While her ex-husband helped with parenting duties, Judy still faced financial challenges as a single mother. Determined to give her daughter something special, she took on a part-time job delivering magazines, hoping to save enough for a mother-daughter trip to Disney World the following summer. It was hard work, but Judy was focused, especially on giving Kay the kind of childhood she deserved. On the evening of May 23, 1994, Judy was at home preparing for her shift. She sat at the kitchen table, stuffing leaflets into each magazine, stacking them one by one. The plan was simple: finish up, make her deliveries, then take Kay to McDonald's as a treat. Around 6:45 p.m., Kay came into the room and asked if she could go outside to ride her tricycle. It was a warm, sunny evening, the kind that made suburban streets feel extra safe. And when Judy glanced out the window, she saw other neighborhood kids already playing in the yard. It seemed harmless enough. She told Kay to stay close, right there in the yard, and with that, her daughter rushed out the door, pedaling down the driveway on her little trike. Judy had just a few more leaflets to finish. Just a few minutes. Once she was done, she gathered the stack of magazines and walked them to her car. She planned to call Kay back inside so they could head out, but when she stepped outside, Kay was gone. She looked around the yard. No tricycle, no giggling, no tiny figure in sight. Judy called out her name. Once, twice. Louder each time. Silence. Judy hurried through the yard, scanning every corner, calling out Kay's name with growing urgency. There was no sign of her daughter, and no sound of her tricycle either. That was what struck Judy the most. The little plastic wheels always made a loud creaking noise as Kay rode. It was the kind of sound you couldn't miss. But now, the silence was deafening. Her worry quickly spiraled into panic. Judy's shouts drew the attention of nearby neighbors, who rushed outside to see what was wrong. She frantically asked if anyone had seen her daughter. A few people remembered Kay playing earlier with the other kids, but no one had seen where she went, or when she disappeared. Word of Kay's disappearance spread quickly, and soon the neighbors joined in the search. People combed the apartment complex on foot, calling her name, checking behind buildings and in wooded areas. But Kay and her tricycle were nowhere to be found. The layout of the complex made her sudden vanishing even more alarming. Much of the area was surrounded by trees, and the entire perimeter was fenced off, separating the residential units from a nearby highway. Judy knew her daughter. Kay never wandered. She knew the rules. She wasn't allowed to leave the yard, and she'd never disobeyed before. Her tricycle was small, and she couldn't have gone far even if she tried. If she had simply pedaled off, someone would have seen her. But no one had. Terrified, Judy called the police. Officers responded within minutes, and the search ramped up immediately. Firefighters and canine units arrived to assist. While search teams scoured the grounds, officers began going door to door, speaking with every resident. At that point, detectives began working under a grim assumption. This wasn't a case of a child wandering off. This was likely an abduction. But how? The complex was enclosed. It would have been almost impossible for a stranger to walk in, snatch a child in broad daylight, and vanish without anyone noticing. That left them with only one logical conclusion. If Kay had been taken, the person responsible was likely someone who lived among them. The apartment complex was home to nearly 300 units, and in a show of unity and concern, the residents opened their doors to help. Police officers were welcomed inside one unit after another, determined to leave no corner unchecked. When no one was home, the complex manager used spare keys to grant access. Still, the hours passed with no sign of Kay or her tricycle. Apartment after apartment. Nothing. The search stretched through the night. By 4 a.m., the situation had become increasingly grim. With no leads and no trace of the missing child, authorities officially reclassified the case as a kidnapping. A specialized unit took over the investigation, and detectives sat down with Judy to ask the hard questions. Did she know anyone who might want to hurt her or her daughter? They brought up Kay's father, but Judy dismissed the idea completely. He had always been involved in Kay's life and had no reason to take her. There was no bad blood, no motive. Then detectives shifted the focus to the people living in the complex. Was there anyone who had ever raised concern? That's when Judy mentioned Mark. He was a 22-year-old man who had recently moved into the complex with his wife and young son. Judy said they'd spoken a few times in the yard, just casual small talk, but something about him had always made her uncomfortable. She recalled one specific interaction that left her deeply unsettled. Mark had complimented Kay's appearance. That alone wasn't unusual. People often said Kay was a beautiful little girl, but it was the way he said it that sent a chill down her spine. There was a strange tone in his voice. Then he said something even more disturbing. He told her he'd been watching all the little girls in the complex, and that Kay was the prettiest. Judy was stunned. The remark was so out of line, so casually inappropriate, that she immediately began avoiding him. But it didn't end there. On another occasion, Mark approached her again in the yard and asked a question that stopped her cold. Would Kay tell you if someone tried to touch her? Judy didn't hesitate. She said yes, and then left without saying another word. She didn't want to speak to him again after that. The question had crossed every boundary of decency. Now, recalling those conversations in the context of her daughter's disappearance, Judy's unease turned into dread. She shared everything with the detectives, and suddenly, Mark was no longer just a neighbor. He was now their lead suspect. Before those unsettling conversations with Mark, Kay used to play with his young son at the playground. The two children had become fast friends, but after Mark's disturbing comments, Judy stopped allowing her daughter anywhere near him, even if she was watching closely. Something about the man felt wrong, and Judy trusted her instincts. As she sat with detectives, Judy recalled a moment from the night Kay vanished, one she hadn't thought much of in the haze of panic. Just minutes after she had stepped outside and realized Kay was gone, she saw Mark in the yard, heading toward the playground with his son. She'd asked if he'd seen Kay. Mark simply said no. But now, in hindsight, another detail stood out. She remembered noticing that Mark's sneakers were missing their shoelaces. At the time, her mind was spiraling with fear, and she hadn't dwelled on it. But now it seemed strange, out of place, suspicious. Detectives decided it was time to speak with Mark directly. They brought him in for questioning. Calmly, he denied any involvement in Kay's disappearance and agreed to take a polygraph. He passed. The test didn't register any signs of deception, and with no physical evidence against him, they had no choice but to let him go. To make matters more complicated, Judy herself had inadvertently given him an alibi. She'd seen him on the playground with his son right after Kay vanished, during the exact time frame her daughter likely disappeared. Police had also already searched Mark's apartment early in the investigation and found nothing. No Kay, no tricycle, no evidence. With no solid leads and nothing tying Mark to the case, investigators moved on. And with nowhere else to look, their focus shifted toward Judy. They began scrutinizing her. Standard procedure, they said. Judy understood that. She knew the police had to consider all possibilities, even the unthinkable. She cooperated fully, answering every question, no matter how painful. But the constant interrogations, the subtle doubts, only deepened her anguish. She had lost her daughter, and now she was being asked to prove she hadn't done it. As the days passed, Kay's story spread beyond the complex. Her face appeared on local news reports, billboards, flyers pinned to telephone poles, and taped to store windows across the city. The community responded in force. Tips flooded in, hundreds at first, then more than 1,000. Detectives chased down every single one, and every single one led nowhere. The case eventually stalled. The search slowed. Hope began to fade. Kay Polton's disappearance went from an active investigation to a cold case, and Judy was left in silence, surrounded by unanswered questions and the echo of a missing child's laughter. Even as the case grew cold, Judy refused to let hope die. She quit her job and devoted herself fully to the search for her daughter. Day in and day out, she printed flyers, made phone calls, contacted news outlets, and pleaded with anyone who would listen. Her mission was simple: to keep Kay's name alive and her face visible. Soon, others joined her cause. Strangers, neighbors, and compassionate volunteers helped post flyers, organize search efforts, and raise money. Together, they collected $100,000 to offer as a reward for any information that could lead to Kay's whereabouts. Judy's persistence pushed the case beyond local headlines. She appeared on national television, including a heartfelt interview on the Oprah Winfrey Show. Twice, Kay's story was featured on a widely watched crime series focused on unsolved cases. Judy also partnered with local businesses to keep Kay's face front and center, in store windows, on bulletin boards, and even on company vehicles. She went as far as convincing 2 airlines to include missing person flyers inside passenger ticket envelopes. Her tireless efforts brought in new leads, some credible, some not. The police followed up on every tip, never ignoring a single one. But none of them brought them closer to the truth. For 2 long years, the case remained stuck in a devastating limbo. Then, on August 9, 1996, everything changed. That night, a woman called the police, clearly distressed. She'd had a serious argument with her husband and had finally reached her breaking point. She told the dispatcher she was tired of his erratic, unsettling behavior and was ready to leave him. During the fight, her husband, desperate to make her stay, broke down. He started rambling about his troubled past and how hard life had been for him. Then, in a moment that left her stunned, he blurted out a confession. He said he had killed Kayan Polton. Shocked and terrified, the woman grabbed their child and fled to her father's house. From there, she called 911 and told the police everything. The man's name was Mark Christie, Judy's former neighbor. The same man who'd once told her Kay was the prettiest girl in the complex. The man who had stood in the yard with his toddler just minutes after Kay disappeared. The man no one had been able to prove was guilty, until now. Detectives were stunned by Mark Christie's wife and her chilling revelation. But almost immediately, they hit a major legal wall. Under state law, any private communication between spouses is protected. It's inadmissible in court. No matter how damning her statement was, it couldn't be used as evidence. That meant even if Mark had truly confessed, police couldn't legally arrest him based on what his wife said. To make matters worse, they had already searched Mark's apartment back when Kay vanished. Judy herself had seen him in the yard with his child just minutes after Kay disappeared, making it hard to believe he had time to abduct and kill her without being seen. Still, Detective Crow, who had taken the wife's statement, wasn't ready to back down. He began digging into Mark's background again. He quickly discovered that shortly after Kay's disappearance, Mark and his family had abruptly moved out of the complex. The reason? Several disturbing complaints had been filed against him by other residents. 2 separate parents reported that Mark had been standing completely naked in the doorway of his apartment, clearly visible to anyone outside, including children. No formal charges were filed, since he was technically inside his own home, but the behavior raised serious red flags. Now Mark was living in a town about 50 miles from Rochester. Crow made the drive and knocked on the door. It was answered by Mark's mother, who curtly informed him that her son wouldn't speak without an attorney present. Clearly, Mark had already learned about his wife's call to police and was preparing his defense. Crow knew he was running out of options. With the spousal confession legally untouchable and a lawyer now in the picture, there wasn't much room to maneuver. But just as the conversation with Mark's mother was wrapping up, Mark appeared. Thinking fast, Crow softened his tone. He explained that he wasn't there to interrogate him or make accusations, just to talk, informally, nothing official. Surprisingly, Mark agreed. On one condition: after the conversation, Crow would drive him to see his lawyer. Crow accepted. They got in the car and drove to a nearby restaurant. Over coffee with no handcuffs and no pressure, the detective began asking questions. He knew this might be his only shot, and he needed to make it count. They stopped at a nearby Italian restaurant, and Detective Crow kept things light, steering the conversation away from anything too direct. He didn't want Mark to feel cornered. His goal was to get him talking, not to interrogate him. Over dinner, as the atmosphere relaxed, Mark unexpectedly began to open up. He admitted that what happened to Kay had haunted him for years. Her face was everywhere, on the news, on flyers, even in his dreams. Sensing an opening, Crow stayed calm and empathetic. He subtly played into Mark's ego, saying how impressive it was that he managed to deceive everyone. Mark took the bait. He said he wasn't trying to brag, But what he did with the tricycle was, in his words, ingenious. Then, almost like a tease, he asked Crow if he wanted to know what he did with it, clarifying he'd only talk about the bike, nothing else. Crow nodded, keeping his tone casual. That's when Mark started to explain. After Kay's disappearance, the tricycle had stayed in his apartment for 3 days. He knew the police would search every unit, but he also knew something crucial because they were looking for a missing child. They didn't need a warrant. That meant legally, they could only search places where a child could hide, not drawers, bags, or closets. So Mark disassembled the bike piece by piece. Some parts he wrapped in clothes and tucked into his closets. Others he bagged up and loaded into his car gradually. There were police posted at every exit of the complex, but they weren't looking for trash bags. They were watching for a child. Nothing he carried raised suspicion. As Mark talked, Detective Crow could feel they were on the edge of a full confession. He carefully adjusted his approach. Softening his tone, he floated the idea that maybe Kay's death wasn't entirely his fault. Maybe it had been an accident. Mark paused, visibly weighing his words, then asked the question Crow had been hoping for. What kind of sentence would he be facing? Crow replied that it could be something like 25 years. Mark shook his head. He said it didn't seem fair to lose half his life, to be taken away from his wife and son. He claimed he'd already been living in his own personal hell for the past 2 years, and maybe that should count for something. Crow didn't challenge him. He knew Mark was looking for a way to justify what he'd done. So he leaned in gently and suggested that if Mark truly wanted peace, if he really was haunted, then maybe the only way forward was to be honest. Not just for himself, but for his family, for Kay's parents, to finally let them know the truth. Mark looked up and said quietly, "She didn't suffer." That was it, the moment Crow had been waiting for. He didn't interrupt, just let the silence pull the truth out. Mark said he was ready to tell everything, but only after speaking to a lawyer. Crow knew what that meant. Any attorney would shut the conversation down immediately. So he decided to go straight to the heart of it. If you wait, he told Mark, Kay's parents will never know what happened. They'll never know if she was scared, if she was in pain, if she called out for them. That hit home. Mark repeated, even softer this time, "She didn't suffer." And then, finally, he admitted it. He had strangled her. He was quick to add that he hadn't done anything else. No assault, no abuse. He claimed Kay had come over that afternoon to play with his young son. He let her in and moved her tricycle to the kitchen, making sure Judy wouldn't see it from outside. He knew Kay wasn't supposed to be in the apartment. Kay went upstairs to the kids' room. Minutes later, Judy stepped outside, calling for her daughter. That's when Mark panicked. Instead of sending Kay home, he climbed the stairs. Then, overwhelmed by fear, he strangled her with his bare hands. Detective Crow had immediate doubts about parts of Mark's confession. The story didn't add up. It seemed far more likely that Mark hadn't just panicked after Kay showed up. He had planned it. Crow suspected Mark had deliberately lured the girl inside, using his toddler son as bait, knowing his wife was at work. Maybe he had intended to molest her, and when Judy suddenly began calling for Kay, he panicked. Not out of guilt, but fear. Fear that Kay would tell. Crow also remembered Judy's observation that Mark's sneakers had no laces that day. It struck him now. Mark might have taken them out to use as a weapon. If so, this wasn't a snap decision. He had time to think about what he was doing. But Crow didn't challenge him. He needed the rest of the story. Mark kept going. He said that after killing Kay, he carried her downstairs and laid her on the kitchen floor. Then, as if nothing had happened, he picked up his son and went outside. He wanted to be seen. It was calculated. He positioned himself right where Judy and the neighbors would notice him while she was frantically searching and calling her daughter's name. Once he made sure he'd been seen, Mark headed back inside. He placed Kay's body in a laundry basket, covered her with clothes, and carried it out to his car's trunk. By that point, the yard was filling up with people. The search was chaotic, but somehow no one noticed a man walking past with a laundry basket. He loaded his son into the car and drove to the facility where he worked nights as a security guard. That night was his day off, so to avoid raising any suspicion, he told his co-workers he'd forgotten something at work. He parked near the rear of the large building and left the laundry basket outside a back entrance. Then he walked around to the front and entered through the main doors, pretending everything was normal. Once inside, he opened the back door, pulled in the basket, and carried it to a massive 30,000-gallon tank used to hold liquid coolant. He climbed on top of the tank, opened the lid, and dropped Kay's body in, after tying a heavy piece of metal to weigh her down. He threw away her clothes but left her earrings on. Then he went home, casually blending back into the search effort. Police hadn't even arrived yet. He had managed to hide the evidence before anyone knew she was missing. With Mark's full confession in hand, Detective Crow paid the bill, and Mark quietly left a small tip. Then, without resistance, he followed the detective to the station, where he was officially placed under arrest for murder. When Mark's lawyer found out, he immediately tried to get the confession tossed out, but the attempt failed. The statement had been made voluntarily, and Crow hadn't violated any laws or procedures. Acting quickly, police headed straight to Mark's workplace and opened the industrial tank. 2 years after she vanished, Kay's body was still there, though the extent of decomposition made it impossible for medical experts to determine her exact cause of death or whether she'd been assaulted. Her identity was confirmed. At last, Judy was able to lay her daughter to rest. Mark pleaded guilty in court and received a minimum sentence of 25 years in prison, just as Crow had predicted. His attorney managed to strike a deal that removed the kidnapping charge, leaving only the murder conviction. But Mark's criminal history didn't end there. In 2010, a cold case from 1988 was reopened. A 74-year-old woman, Viola Manville, had been brutally murdered while out walking in a suburb of Rochester. Back then, Mark, only 16 at the time, had been questioned by police but was released after passing a polygraph. Eventually, investigators arrested another man, Frank Sterling. Although he initially denied any involvement, he confessed after a long overnight interrogation. Years later, Frank claimed the confession was coerced. His appeals went nowhere, until 2010, when the case was reviewed again and new DNA testing was done. The results didn't match Frank. Instead, they pointed straight to Mark Christie. In 2011, at 39 years old, Mark admitted to killing Viola Manville and received an additional 28-year sentence. He showed no remorse and gave no explanation. Frank, meanwhile, was freed after spending 19 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He was later awarded nearly $10 million in compensation. Tragically, just 3 years after his release, he died of a heart attack at the age of 54. Mark Christie remains in prison today and could be eligible for parole in the future. If investigators hadn't focused so narrowly on one suspect back in Viola's case, they might have caught Mark sooner, and Kay could still be alive. Share your thoughts on this story in the comment section. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Case 5. Charlotte Cena, 2023, New York. Charlotte Cena was born on September 4, 2014, in the quiet town of Greenfield, New York. Nestled in a scenic stretch of upstate, the town, with a population just over 5,000, offered a peaceful setting surrounded by forests, lakes, and sprawling parks. Charlotte, the middle of 3 sisters, thrived in this environment. She was energetic, sociable, and happiest when she was outdoors, riding bikes, playing with friends, or exploring nature with her family. On the afternoon of September 30th, 2023, 9-year-old Charlotte and her family headed out on a short getaway to a nearby national park, just 11 miles from their home. They were joined by friends, and the plan was simple: enjoy the fresh air, set up camp, and let the kids roam a bit. Charlotte brought her bike, excited to ride with her friends on a circular trail that looped close to the campsite, a trail specifically meant for young riders. At around 6:15 p.m., the kids started their ride, with plans to be back before dark. After completing a few laps, Charlotte's friends decided to head back to camp. Charlotte, wanting just one more round, kept going. They split off, her friends in one direction, Charlotte in the other. When 10 minutes passed and she hadn't returned, her parents started to worry. That trail loop didn't take long to ride. They walked it themselves, calling her name, hoping to see her pedaling back. Instead, they found her bike lying on the side of the trail around 6:45 p.m. No damage, no flat tires, no broken chain. Just abandoned. There was no sign of Charlotte anywhere nearby. She wouldn't have just left her bike like that, not without a reason. Her parents didn't wait. Fearing the worst, they called the police. Officers arrived at the park within 15 minutes of the 911 call and immediately launched a search. The abandoned bicycle raised serious concerns. It strongly pointed to an abduction. Still, police couldn't dismiss the possibility that Charlotte might have simply gotten lost, so they cast a wide net. The entire park was closed off to visitors. Every vehicle and campsite was inspected before anyone was allowed to leave. Some parkgoers offered to assist in the search, but authorities declined. Uncoordinated help could disturb the area and interfere with critical evidence. The initial search concentrated on the circular trail where Charlotte had last been seen, but it turned up nothing. The operation quickly expanded across the entire park, covering nearly 15 square kilometers. The size of the area made the job overwhelming. Local police called in backup: park rangers, firefighters, state troopers, and eventually the FBI. As ground crews searched, federal agents turned their attention to digital leads. They pulled surveillance footage from every camera around the park and along nearby roads. If Charlotte had been taken, chances were the suspect used a vehicle, and the footage might help track it down. Agents also requested a list of park visitors. Everyone was required to register and pay to enter, so the database could offer valuable clues. Cell phone data from towers in the area was also gathered to cross-reference who had been nearby around the time Charlotte disappeared. But combing through it all would take time. The search continued through the night without success. By morning, the effort had grown to more than 400 people. Investigators issued a public appeal and activated the Amber Alert system. They hadn't triggered it the night before, holding on to hope that she was lost in the woods. But as the second day began, that hope had faded. All signs now pointed to a kidnapping, and Charlotte was still missing. By the second evening, the situation felt increasingly bleak. Investigators knew that the first few hours after a child goes missing are the most crucial. With each passing moment, the odds of finding Charlotte alive diminished. Still, no one, neither law enforcement nor her devastated parents, was ready to give up. At dawn on the third day, search teams were back in the park, while FBI analysts continued combing through visitor logs and cell data. Then, at around 4:20 a.m., something unexpected happened. A man pulled up to the Cena home, walked to their mailbox, dropped something inside, and quickly drove away. A police officer posted outside spotted him but didn't stop him, assuming, like others who had visited in recent days, that he was simply a well-wisher offering support. But something about the man's behavior didn't sit right, so the officer decided to check the mailbox. Inside was a ransom note. The author claimed to have Charlotte and demanded $50,000 for her return. The letter was rushed to a forensic lab for immediate analysis. Technicians lifted several fingerprints, and while the first scan returned no hits, a follow-up check turned up a match. Craig Nelson Ross Jr., a 47-year-old man with a prior DUI arrest from 1999. His prints had been entered into the state database. Ross lived just a few miles from the Sena family. Investigators learned that his listed address had recently been seized due to unpaid taxes, but further digging revealed he was now staying in a trailer on his mother's property, about 14 miles away. Acting fast, police secured a warrant. Before sunrise, more than 30 officers surrounded the trailer, backed by a helicopter overhead. They used flash grenades to disorient anyone inside, then stormed the building. Ross resisted arrest, but was quickly subdued. At first, there was no sign of Charlotte. Officers swept through the trailer, checking every room and corner, until they reached a locked closet. When they forced it open, they found Charlotte, hidden beneath a pile of rags. She was alive. The moment the door opened, she bolted into the arms of the officers. She was rushed to the hospital, where doctors confirmed she was physically unharmed and in stable condition. Her family met her there before she was taken home later that day. News of her rescue spread rapidly, bringing relief and celebration across the community. Her parents, law enforcement, and the hundreds of volunteers who had spent days searching were overwhelmed with joy. At the exact moment of Charlotte's rescue, her mother had been in the park helping with search efforts. Just 10 minutes before getting the call, she had told others she felt strongly that her daughter would be found that day. She was right. Craig Nelson Ross Jr. was taken into custody and held without bail. Detectives began questioning him, though details of the interrogation weren't made public. He did not confess, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. His fingerprint was on the ransom note, and Charlotte had been discovered locked in his closet. Cell tower records placed his phone at the park around the time she disappeared. Soon after the arrest, Ross's ex-girlfriend spoke to reporters. She described a troubling history, including an incident in 2017 when she filed a restraining order after he allegedly tried to strangle her. According to her, Ross had no interest in holding a job and depended on his mother financially. She believed he had planned the abduction for some time, motivated by money. Charlotte's family had long been known in the area because her grandfather once received a sizable legal settlement, something that might have made them a target. According to Ross's ex-girlfriend, he may have been watching Charlotte's family for some time, studying their routine and waiting for the right opportunity to strike. That theory gained traction after investigators learned that several months before the abduction, Ross had covered his trailer with a tarp, something he had never done before. Police believed it could have been a deliberate move to prepare the space for hiding someone inside. Neighbors also came forward with troubling accounts. One woman recalled a disturbing incident where Ross tried to walk off with her 10-year-old son, forcing her to step in. Another neighbor described the entire Ross family as troubled, saying that even as a child, Ross would knock on doors asking for food. As detectives continued digging, more of Ross's past came into focus. Just a year before the alleged attack on his ex-girlfriend, he'd been arrested for stalking, but the charges didn't lead to any serious consequences. Even more concerning, only a month before Charlotte vanished, he had been accused of sexually assaulting an underage relative. For reasons that have not been publicly disclosed, that case was eventually closed. Ross's adult son also spoke with the media. He didn't hold back, expressing clear hatred for his father and saying he hoped he would die in prison. Though he avoided specifics, he made it clear that their relationship was non-existent and that he viewed his father as a dangerous man. Roughly a month after Ross's arrest, the investigation took a darker turn. Authorities announced new charges against him, not just for kidnapping, but for sexually assaulting Charlotte. While they didn't release details about the case, the charge alone confirmed the public's worst fears. Ross denied the allegations and planned to fight them in court. Despite Ross's continued denials, the case against him was strong. His fingerprint on the ransom note and cell phone data placing him in the park were only the beginning. A thorough search of his trailer revealed conditions that suggested Charlotte's abduction had been planned in advance, supporting the charge of premeditation. As investigators built their case, they also began to look into Ross's possible connection to other unsolved crimes. In August 2003, 18-year-old Jennifer Hammond went missing while selling magazines in Milton, not far from where Ross had lived. She never returned to meet up with her co-workers. 6 years later, her remains were discovered near a lake, just 11 miles from Ross's former home. 2 years after Jennifer disappeared, another woman, 19-year-old Christina White, vanished after leaving a trailer park only a mile from Milton. Her body was found a year later, but her case, like Jennifer's, had remained unsolved. At the time of both disappearances, Ross had been living nearby, first near the lake and later at the trailer park where Christina was last seen. Detectives reopened both cases to search for possible links to Ross, but for now, they hadn't uncovered solid proof, or were holding back key details while the investigation continued. Charlotte's case was headed to trial in April 2024. While the evidence appeared overwhelming, prosecutors were weighing a plea deal. The main reason: to avoid forcing Charlotte to testify. If Ross refused to admit guilt, she could be called to the witness stand and made to recount the trauma of her abduction. A plea would guarantee a lengthy sentence and spare her from that experience. All anyone could do now was wait, and hope the legal system delivered the justice Charlotte deserved. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. Case 6. Mitzi Sanchez, 2000, California. Mitzi Sanchez was born on August 10, 1992, in Vallejo, California. She was part of a big, tight-knit family, with 2 brothers and a sister. Mitzi was a happy, energetic child who loved playing outside with friends and spending time with her siblings. Even from a young age, she was independent. By the time she started elementary school, her parents trusted her to walk there with her brother. The school was nearby, just a short route along a busy road. On the morning of August 10, 2000, her 8th birthday, Mitzi was buzzing with excitement about the celebration planned for later that day. She asked her mom if she could skip school, hoping to start the festivities early, but her mother told her no. Disappointed, but not discouraged, Mitzi left home with her brother around 7:30 a.m. She was expected to wait for him after school so they could walk home together, as usual. But when he came out, she was gone. Assuming she might have headed home early, he made the walk back alone. But when he arrived and realized she wasn't there, alarm bells started ringing. Their older sister, who had stayed home that day, knew Mitzi had been excited for her birthday party. There was no reason she would disappear willingly. She waited a little longer, hoping her sister would walk through the door. But by 4 p.m., she called their mom at work. Their mother immediately contacted the school and was told Mitzi had been in class the entire day. She called around to friends and relatives, but no one had seen her. Panic set in. The family launched their own search, enlisting neighbors and relatives. They combed the area, knocking on doors and handing out flyers. But by nightfall, there was still no trace of Mitzi. Fearing the worst, her parents finally called 911. Police quickly joined the search, and by that same afternoon, local news stations were broadcasting Mitzi's disappearance. The case immediately struck a nerve, especially because Vallejo had seen similar tragedies before. For years, children had gone missing under unexplained circumstances. The most recent case was just 9 months earlier, in December 1999, when 7-year-old Ziana Fairchild vanished on her way to school. Despite months of searching by both local police and the FBI, she had never been found. Now, with another young girl missing in nearly identical conditions, investigators feared the worst. There were no concrete leads, but the parallels were too strong to ignore. With Ziana's case still unresolved, detectives began revisiting old suspects and retracing their steps through earlier evidence. But once again, nothing definitive surfaced. Media coverage quickly expanded across California, and the sense of fear was palpable. Parents kept their children home. Schools tightened their release procedures. Mitzi's family made repeated pleas on television, her mother tearfully begging for her daughter's safe return. Tips flooded in, but none led to a breakthrough. Then, just one day after Mitzi disappeared, a possible lead surfaced. A man contacted police saying he'd found blood-stained rags at a local landfill. When officers arrived, they realized the rags were actually bedsheets, and they weren't ordinary ones. The fabric bore the markings of a hotel in Vallejo. The sheets were collected and sent to a lab for testing, though results would take time. Police also visited the hotel, but found no evidence linking the location to Mitzi. With few other options, detectives returned to the landfill to dig deeper, hoping something else had been discarded that could offer answers. But after hours of searching, they came up empty-handed. Then, on the morning of August the 12th, 2 days after Mitzi vanished, everything changed. Around 11 a.m., a man driving through an industrial area in Santa Clara noticed a young girl suddenly dash toward his van, visibly terrified. She flung the door open, jumped inside, and screamed that someone was chasing her. Frantic, she pointed to a man sprinting toward them and yelled that he had kidnapped her and was trying to kill her. The moment she got into the van, the man stopped in his tracks, turned around, and quickly fled to his own car, speeding away. The driver didn't hesitate. He called the police immediately. When officers arrived, the girl identified herself as Mitzi Sanchez. She was quickly taken to a hospital, where doctors confirmed she was dehydrated and in shock, but otherwise physically unharmed. Her family was notified, and they rushed to be by her side. Her safe return felt nothing short of miraculous, but the details she shared with investigators were deeply disturbing. Mitzi told them that on the day she vanished, she had decided to walk home slightly ahead of her brother. As she approached a parked car, a man inside called out to her, He claimed he had injured his leg and asked if she could help retrieve a roll of tape from under his seat. Though uneasy, Mitzi agreed to help. As soon as she leaned into the vehicle, he grabbed her, shoved her inside, covered her mouth, and slammed the door. She struggled and tried to scream, but he sped away. At one point, they drove right past her home. She could see her family setting up for her birthday celebration. Then, he pulled into a deserted parking lot, forced her to change into different clothes, and tossed her old ones in a nearby trash bin. He warned her that he had a gun and claimed no one had ever escaped him. Later, he chained her by the leg inside the car, forced her to drink alcohol, and took photos of her. That night, the man slept in the car right next to Mitzi. She didn't sleep at all, too scared to close her eyes. At one point, she saw a police cruiser pass in the distance, but it was too far away. There was no way they could hear her cries. The next morning, the man kept her hidden under a sheet in the back of the vehicle as he made several stops to buy cigarettes and alcohol. At one of those stops, while stepping out of the car, something slipped from his pocket, a bulky key ring with dozens of keys. Before leaving, he warned her not to touch anything and walked off. Mitzi sat frozen for a moment, terrified, but when she was sure he was gone, she reached for the key ring. Her hands shaking, she tried key after key until, finally, one clicked. The padlock securing the chain around her leg popped open. She was free. But she was weak and disoriented. She tried to crawl out the window but struggled. When she finally made it out, she didn't get far before the man spotted her. He came after her. She ran, doing everything she could to flag down passing cars, but no one stopped. Then she saw a van approaching. Acting on instinct, she jumped in front of it. The driver slammed on the brakes just in time. Mitzi flung open the door and climbed in, begging for help. That driver's fast reaction likely saved her life. Police soon traced the suspect's license plate, captured as he drove past the van during his escape. The car was registered to 39-year-old Curtis Dean Anderson. His record was extensive. Prior arrests for theft, kidnapping, and suspicion in other serious offenses. He'd previously served time for abducting a woman in 1991 and had been out of prison for just 9 months when he took Mitzi. During her captivity, Anderson chillingly told her she wasn't his first victim and claimed no one else had ever escaped. Police wasted no time launching a full-scale search for Curtis Dean Anderson. Surveillance teams were deployed to places he was known to visit. That same evening, he returned to a trailer park and was quietly taken into custody without putting up a fight. As detectives began to examine his background more closely, they became convinced that Mitzi hadn't been his first victim. The details of the abduction were too methodical. He had come prepared, with extra clothes for her, chains to restrain her, alcohol to control her, and a plan for moving between locations. His behavior pointed to experience. Investigators immediately suspected a link to another case, the disappearance of 7-year-old Ziana Fairchild, who had vanished from the same area less than a year earlier. Mitzi had even mentioned that during her time in captivity, Anderson spoke about another girl, one she believed was also a victim. Adding to the concern, detectives discovered that on the very day Mitzi escaped, Anderson had visited his old workplace and asked for a large bag, something they believed he intended to use to dispose of her body. After his arrest, Mitzi showed incredible bravery by testifying against him in court. In April 2001, Anderson was sentenced to 251 years in prison. But that wasn't the end of the story. Investigators kept returning to speak with him, determined to find out whether there were more victims. Eventually, Anderson confided in a fellow inmate, claiming he had killed 8 other girls. The inmate agreed to cooperate and passed that disturbing confession on to police. Though Anderson remained vague and refused to confirm everything, he began dropping hints, especially about Sienna Fairchild. Then, in 2005, he finally admitted to killing her. That confession brought him another 50-year sentence. Mitzi's nightmare didn't end when Curtis Dean Anderson was convicted. In fact, her return home brought a new wave of hardship. Just weeks later, she tried to go back to school, hoping for a sense of normalcy. Instead, she was met with cruelty. Classmates mocked her, calling her the kidnapped girl and making heartless remarks, some even saying she should have died instead of being found. Already carrying the weight of trauma, Mitzi now faced isolation and shame in what should have been a safe place. Still, she tried to move forward. She began volunteering in searches for other missing children, hoping to make a difference. But each new case, especially those that ended in tragedy, hit her hard. The sorrow wasn't abstract. It felt personal. Over time, the grief and unresolved pain became too much. Mitzi turned to alcohol to cope. What started as a way to escape became her default response to the pain. She withdrew, and the idea of living a normal life seemed further and further out of reach. Then, everything changed. After leaving a party, Mitzi was involved in a serious car accident. She suffered a broken neck and arm and slipped into a coma for 2 weeks. When she woke up, doctors gave her news that stunned her. She was pregnant. She would have a daughter. That moment became a turning point. Determined not to pass on her pain, Mitzi made a decision. She quit drinking and began the long road to healing. She channeled her experience into something greater, founding a nonprofit organization to support victims of child crimes and families of the missing. That organization still operates today, offering counseling, legal guidance, and advocacy to those navigating the same darkness she once faced. As for Anderson, he died of an illness in 2007, just 6 years into his sentence. Detectives admitted frustration that he passed before revealing the full extent of his crimes. They believe Mitzi and Ziana were not his only victims, but with his death, many answers likely died with him. Tragically, the violence didn't end with him. Years later, Anderson's son was convicted of murder and died in prison in 2019, closing a dark chapter that had already taken too much.